NFL prediction season is already underway, and the DraftKings Sportsbook has made projections in the NFL for how teams are going to do. So let's take a look at the NFC North. The Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions are projected to win 10.5 games. And then the Chicago Bears are projected to win 8.5 games. And the Minnesota Vikings, their over-under projection is 6.5 games. And my first reaction looking at this is, wow, they have the Minnesota Vikings really low. The Minnesota Vikings added key defensive players. They have most of their offensive players coming back besides the obvious ones in Kirk Cousins and TJ Hockenson being, a few months late to the start of the season because of his ACL, MCL injury. But the offensive line is mainly intact. The defense just got even better. The wide receivers for the Minnesota Vikings should be even better the following season. So I was wondering why in the world the Vikings are projected to only win 6.5 games. And they were tied for last place in the NFC North last year with the Chicago Bears, so they should have a favorable schedule. So let's take a look at the Minnesota Vikings home opponents. Obviously, you got the 3 division games against the Bears, Lions, and Packers. And then you look at the Arizona Cardinals, the San Francisco 49ers, and then it's the Houston Texans and Indianapolis Colts. And then it's the Atlanta Falcons and the New York Jets. You look at the Minnesota Vikings road opponents. Obviously, you got the 3 divisional games against the Bears, Lions, and Packers. And then you got the Rams. You got the Seahawks. You got the Jacksonville Jaguars. And you got the Tennessee Titans, the New York Giants. First of all, my first reaction when looking at this is, will the Minnesota Vikings, is it ever possible for the Minnesota Vikings to play the Seattle Seahawks in Minnesota? The only time I can ever recall that happening is when Blair Walsh missed a 27-yard field goal. Every single year when the Vikings play the Seahawks, the NFL always schedules that game in Seattle. And the Minnesota Vikings rarely, I think maybe once, they have won that game, if ever. But anyway, looking at the schedule real quick. Before Kirk Cousins signed with the Atlanta Falcons, I chalked that game up as a W. Now, I'm not so sure on that. The New York Jets, maybe it's going to be a victory, but we don't know what Aaron Rodgers is going to look like, and we have no idea how that's going to look because he didn't really play for them last year because of his injury. The Arizona Cardinals beat them last year. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll beat them this year, but I would probably chalk that up as a W. San Francisco 49ers. The Vikings beat them last year, but was that a little fluky? Maybe. I wouldn't bet on the Minnesota Vikings to beat the 49ers. And the Houston Texans and the Indianapolis Colts. The Texans were a playoff team last year in C.J. Stroud's rookie year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to advance in the playoffs and be an even better team. Every single year, there are teams in the NFL that don't perform to their expectations. And the Houston Texans could be this example next year. You think about, C.J. Stroud going into year 2. Well, in their minds, they're thinking, well, the guy's just going to get better. The guy's just going to progress. The guy's going to become this MVP-type player eventually. And they probably expect the Houston Texans to go into round 2, eventually round 3, perhaps even contending for a Super Bowl as time goes on. But that's not necessarily how the NFL works. The same works for the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. Jordan Love was sensational at the end of the season last year. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to open the season up being one of the top 5, top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL like he was playing at the end of last season. Same with the Detroit Lions. They had rookies really step up. Their running back and their tight end played phenomenally last year. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to put up the same numbers the following year. Jared Goff, is he going to perform as good as he did last year with the Detroit Lions? Just because you're a playoff team one year doesn't necessarily mean you're going to take a step in the next direction the following year. The Minnesota Vikings are a perfect example of that. They went 13-4 under Kevin O'Connell's first year as head coach. Second year, they lost a bunch of one-score games that they won the prior year. The NFL is very unpredictable, so just because they're a playoff team the year before doesn't necessarily mean they're going to take a step forward in the right direction. You know, the Vikings' road opponents, the Rams, the Seahawks, if those were home games, I would chalk those up as W's. But now I'm not quite sure, because those are tough places to play, specifically this Seattle game. I'm sure the Rams game, the Vikings will have a lot of home fans there. The Jaguars and the Titans, that's probably a W, but again, that's a road game. Things get a little bit more tricky on the road. The Jaguars, they didn't make the playoffs last year, but they still got Trevor Lawrence, who's an up-and-coming quarterback, will probably take another step this year. So, and then you got the New York Giants, who knows what's going to happen there. I would probably think that's going to be a W in the Minnesota Vikings category. But at the end of the day, my first reaction was that number was kind of low. But then I look at that number again, and I look at the opponents that the Minnesota Vikings are facing next season with Sam Darnold as QB1 and a rookie quarterback probably being his backup and maybe stepping in mid-season to be that starting quarterback. And my thought is 6.5 is an accurate number. That's pretty accurate at this point in time when you calculate who the Minnesota Vikings are facing off against in home versus away matchups. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, a lot of what the Minnesota Vikings do next season is going to be based off how the Packers and Lions and Bears do. Are the Bears going to take a step in the right direction with Caleb Williams and the defensive pieces that they added? Because they were coming on late at the end of the year. They added Keenan Allen, a good wide receiver, for Caleb Williams to throw the ball to. How will Caleb Williams perform as the number 1 overall pick? That's going to greatly influence if the Minnesota Vikings win more than 6.5 games. Again, like I talked about with Jordan Love earlier, is he going to perform as a top 10 quarterback like he did at the end of last season? That's going to dictate if the Vikings win 6.5 games or not. Same with the Detroit Lions and Jared Goff and the rookies who played well in year 1. So, at the end of the day, 6.5, I would still take the over if you force me to take a pick, but 8.5 would be way too high. 7.5 is close, but 6.5, if the Minnesota Vikings go 7-10, I think 6.5 is a very accurate number by the DraftKings Sportsbook. And it's that right in between number where you would think that the Minnesota Vikings would win more than that with the players that they have on their roster. But yet again, they don't have a rookie quarterback yet. We don't know who that's going to be. And Sam Darnold is the only starting quarterback worthy, or only worthy starting quarterback on the Minnesota Vikings roster right now. So with all of those things taken into consideration, 6.5, it's a fair number. We should not be upset about that from the DraftKings Sportsbook. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you're listening to this podcast. Everyone, take care and have a great day.